Hello, everybody. Good evening. Well, it's evening here. I don't know what it is when you'll watch this, but hope you're having a wonderful day. Welcome to Season Z, Episode 2 of Zebra Reads. Today we're going to be talking about this book, Germinal by Emile Zola. And very excited about this, not necessarily because the book was all that great, but because Zola was a really interesting guy, and he fascinated me. I kind of fell down a little bit of a rabbit hole looking into him. So again, if you're not familiar with what Zebra Reads is about, there is an about video that is linked in the description here, so you should be able to watch that so you know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. But we'll just get into talking about Germinal by Emile Zola. So Zola was a 19th century writer from France, and he was extremely controversial. When I typically think of French writers, I think about Victor Hugo and Les Mis and Alexander Dumas and The Man in the Iron Mask. I had not heard of Zola before, and if I hadn't remembered him. But that could be partly because what he's best known for is really not his novels or his plays. He really wasn't well liked in his time for his novels, and I'll talk about why in a bit. Whereas, fans of Hugo and Dumas really just didn't like him that much. But he was born in Paris in 1840, and he was raised outside of the city, but he grew up mostly in poverty. So he really didn't have much of anything until he was able to get a job when he was a little bit older. And he started being able to submit writing pieces to newspapers and periodicals at the time in France. And so that's sort of where he began to make his name. He was really actually most well known for what's called the Dreyfus Affair. And I feel like somewhere in my brain and history class or something somewhere along the line, I remember the Dreyfus Affair. But what happened was the French military at the time accused and convicted a guy named Alfred Dreyfus of being a spy. Now, Zola and many, many others believed that Dreyfus was set up by the military to take the fall for this because he was Jewish. And evidence kind of surfaced that there was another man who was actually guilty of doing the spy work that Dreyfus was convicted of. And he was tried, but he ended up being acquitted. So Zola published what's known as an infamous editorial about the Dreyfus Affair, and in which he defended Alfred Dreyfus, and he laid blame on the French military for setting this up and fabricating this simply because Dreyfus was Jewish and an easy scapegoat. Now, that led the editorial that Zola led or wrote did lead to Dreyfus's conviction being overturned by the Supreme Court in France. However, it also led to Zola himself being arrested, and he was tried for libel. He was found guilty of libel, and he was sentenced to a year in prison. So it was quite a big to-do. So again, so his journalism is more where he's well known compared to his novels or his plays, which is slightly different than Hugo and Dumas. So Zola was some years after Hugo and Dumas. They were contemporaries, but he was a late contemporary of them. His writing is similarly French. When I read the books, I don't look up the authors beforehand. So I don't if I don't know them, I don't want to know them. I just want to read the book and see what the book is like. And it's only when I sit down to write these episodes that I actually look into who the people are and what they were all about. And so it did feel like a typical French novel to me. But what was different is that, which is what I find really super fascinating, is that in between Hugo and Dumas and Zola came a guy named Charles Darwin. Now, I have said many times I am not a historian, I am not an expert in literature, I have no background in any of this. I just like to read books and I want to tell other people about the books I've read. But I am a scientist, I'm a biologist, so I do know some about Charles Darwin. For those that might not know who Charles Darwin is, he was the guy, he was a naturalist, what they called naturalists in the 1800s, natural philosophers, and he developed the theory of natural selection and common descent, which is what biology currently uses to explain evolution or change over time of organisms. So what is fascinating to me is that Darwin coming in with this genetically controlled idea of change over time and the nature of individuals had such a huge influence way beyond science. So it's influencing the arts and it's influencing literature and all of these things, which is just super fascinating to me. So apparently what happened, and again, I'm not an expert in any of this. I do know Charles Darwin, but I'm not an expert in any of this. So if anybody has better details or some way of explaining it better than me, please comment. But what happened was Darwin didn't know about genes. Okay, he didn't know about DNA and that was what was inherited. But it was very clear that offspring, kids, look like their parents, right? So he assumed there must be some, what we would call genetic component, that is something that's being passed from parents to offspring. And when his theory came into practice, it started this tradition called realism. So it was a realist movement. And what that means is that, I think, if I understood it properly, what that meant was that people believed then that our genetics was stuck. So in a debate of nature versus nurture, it is all nature. We cannot fundamentally change who we are. We cannot be different. We are stuck as who we are. And if we are put into an environment that is not conducive for us to thrive in, then we're not going to thrive. We can't adjust to the environment. We could try to force the environment to change so that our traits are then productive, but we can't change ourselves. We can't change our stripes. So this is very, very different from, say, Victor Hugo in Les Mis, just for example. So if we think about, that whole book is about a man who starts off as a thief, and he is just a thief, and all he is a thief, and he's nothing better than a thief. But by the end of the book, he is a father, and he is a good man, and he is a positive influence on his community and the people around him. And so his nature changed over time. He was able to redeem himself. He was able to adjust to the world and become a better version of himself. Well, Zola and this realist movement that stems from Darwin's idea of, started with Darwin's idea of natural selection, this realism movement, doesn't allow for that change. You are who you are set in stone, and you cannot change. And as I was reading this book, I knew it sounded very French, like it had all of the French sorts of things that, you know, I read in Les Mis, or I read in, you know, The Three Musketeers or The Man in the Iron Mask. It had that French feeling, but it was fundamentally different from those. And so um, reading this about this realist movement and Zola and this idea that people can't change, that the environment would have to change in order to accommodate them, I was able to identify what it was that was so different between, you know, those other books, those earlier books. And publicly, popular wise, people didn't like it. Okay, so they liked the idea that humans have some agency, some ability to change themselves if they want to. And so his writing really wasn't that popular. He's super interesting. Like, even his death was controversial. So he died in 1902. So he was about 62 years old, and he died because his chimney got blocked and his house filled with smoke. So he died of asphyxiation. But there were all of these rumors that he was actually purposely murdered because of his criticism of the French military and the public support he showed for Dreyfus and that. So this guy is just a fascinating author. And the book Germinal is the one that I read. There were a couple at the store, and I just randomly picked one because, again, I hadn't heard of him or anything he's written. So, so to start into talking about the book itself, there's actually like 3 layers to this book. It felt like to me. So the main story revolves around workers and managers of this coal mines that were dotting the French countryside in the 1800s. There was extremely unfair labor practices. There was cripplingly low pay. The workers were basically on the brink of starvation. And suddenly in walks this new guy, ATN, and he's new to the mines, but people really liked him. He had this sort of fervent attitude about him that people kind of clung to. So the story really follows this guy ATN as he tries to, when he wants knowledge, he wants to learn, which in his station he's not really allowed to or supposed to. He wants to be popular among the people in the mining community. He wants companionship. He wants to be equal to the managers of the mines and the people who are above him. He wants a sense of equality, and he wants to be in control. He's very controlling. So if we think about, you know, a set of traits in a nature genetic sort of way, those were his traits. And he moves into the small mining town and starts mining in these mines. Underneath of this, you know, story of ATN is really a lot of political and social statements that I assume reflect the political and social turmoil in France at the time. This was not long after the revolution, I believe, and it was still very sharply divided in class lines. There were inherent biases and about different groups of people, and then there was no union protection for these coal miners. So the owners and the managers could kind of just do whatever they wanted. So those 2 sort of lines were very serious, and they were the length of the book, but sort of that third level underneath those two was a love story. And there were actually a couple of different types of love stories running through this, but it was the love story that sort of seemed to continue to drive the other two. That it was Etienne's quest for love, for that companionship, somebody to be with, that sort of pushed him to keep moving and doing the things that he did. So it was a pretty complex. It's a pretty complex book. My take on it was dense, which is to me pretty typical of French novels. And again, if you read my about or listen to my about episode, you'll see me, you'll hear me mention reading Les Mis was just difficult for me to get through. I have a friend who reads maybe The Man in the Iron Mask all the time, like regularly she reads it, and I sat down and tried to read it once and I couldn't get into it. So it's very similar to those classics. So if you like French classics, if that's what you enjoy, then this is definitely a French classic, but they're not my favorite. The detail is extraordinarily overwhelming sometimes for me, again. And then there were a lot of characters that kind of came in wind, and I lost track of several of them. So I got a little confused there. But I was extremely impressed, again, and I think this is just a skill of those writers at the time in France, but I was just immediately transported into this 19th century life. I could like almost feel the dull pains of hunger that were just there from that extreme poverty, the heat, the stifling air working in the mine shafts, the exhaustion from living that existence. And then you experience all of that, and then within just a few pages, you are transported to this cushy little middle-class manager's home. They've got these nice, well-laid tables, comfortable beds. They have no understanding of the lives of their workers. They're just completely ignorant to it. And you can feel both of those things. And he just does an amazing job of describing those. All of the characters to me were very dichotomous. So like I loved them and hated them at different times, and it was all of them. It wasn't, just one or two. It was all of them having these just very dual natures to them that and again, thinking about that as their personality, and depending on what environment they're put in, it either comes across as good or it comes across as bad. And you can see that with all of them. I couldn't get attached to anybody in the books. I just didn't like them or not. People died. Lots of people died. And I just didn't feel bad for them, really. And I just was so apathetic to so many of the characters because their nature was just themselves apathetic in a sense. And that was Zola's goal, I think, is to convey that. So I think he did a great job of doing that. I didn't like it. I didn't like the book. But man, he was quite a good writer. I have to admit that. And it was amazing. Who should read it? I would again think anybody who likes French literature would probably be interested in this. It is a very typical French book. It very clearly discussed the sort of political strifes associated with this 19th century France environment. The commentary is a little disjointed because we see it all through the eyes of Etienne. So it's all through basically his eyes mostly. And he is searching throughout the book to try to come to terms with his own politics. So we see these glimpses of capitalism, socialism, communism, class warfare, early attempts at unionizing. All of those things are in there. It's not a clean line, but if you're interested in that sort of socio-political climate and how those things develop and what those things look like, there's a lot of discussion about that in the book. The one thing I would recommend it for, to challenge, as a challenge for people, is if there's anybody out here listening to this who really clings to that belief that poor people are somehow deserving to be poor, that they're lazy, they're idle, they don't work hard, they deserve to be in poverty because of those things. I would love for you to read this book, because I think it presents a view of poverty that does highlight the worst of those people, the lengths they'll go to, the terrible things they'll do, and weigh it against this idea of how destitute they are and what survival just looks like to them. And I think it was very eye-opening in a lot of ways. Of course, times have changed an awful lot, but there are certainly still people in situations that are parallel to this. So it would be a good read for somebody to really sort of see this idea of poverty through the lens of somebody else. And Zola, of course, grew up in poverty, so he has a sense of it. All right, so who do I think shouldn't read this book? I'm not a gatekeeper. I have kids that are late teens, but this is a rough book. I don't think kids under the age of 17 should read it, though I'm sure that's being very silly, old-fashioned. It wasn't the best book for kids. Kids shouldn't read it, okay? So maybe if you've got a mature kid who's seen some of these things. But this book has sex in it, it has rape in it, it has murder in it, it has animal and human cruelty in it. It's got spousal abuse, it's got child abuse, and some of it is just purely evil in its description, okay? So there is violence, there is deception, there is murder, there's actual dismemberment. If you're easily offended, there's, by bloodshed or lusty kind of, blatant sex. I wouldn't read it. It just doesn't portray humans in a good light. Again, because of that nature in an environment sort of thing, you put people with a nature into a destitute environment, and you're going to get destitute, desperate people, right? Etienne is this sort of single little link in an armor of intelligence that the lower class is trying to build to lift themselves up. But again, it doesn't work because the environment isn't conducive to them being lifted up. So they just can't quite get there. So bottom line on this book, I would say don't expect a happy ending. It's a sort of a hopeful ending, but not a happy ending. And if you enjoy this really detailed sort of French literature that really just conveys so much, he did a very great job of that. There's just a lot of ick in it as well. So be careful with that. All right, so that is Germinal by Emile Zola. That's our second Zebra Reads episode. And this one is kind of long, but next time we're going to look at a book by Jean Zimmerman. And so I will see you for episode 3. Thanks for joining.